Hi, this is Hank with the Author Stories podcast. Before we get into this week's episode, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Third Scribe, for sponsoring the podcast. Third Scribe is a author website solution that allows authors to connect with readers in a very unique way. Imagine if Facebook and WordPress have a baby, and then that baby is raised by librarians. It grows up, falls in love with a beautiful web designer, and together they bring literary fulfillment to millions. That's Third Scribe. Go check out thirdscribe.com today.
Well, thanks for joining me once again for the Author Stories podcast, where we bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. My guest this week is Kim Wells. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, thanks. Kim, I ask everyone when we start the interview to give us just a little introduction about you and how you came to be a writer.
Well, let's see. I have been writing since I was probably 9. I think that's my first story I remember sharing with someone and having everybody go, "Oh, this is really good." So I'm also a reader. I'm an English major. I went to college all the way up to the piled higher and deeper degree. And so I've been a reader for so long. I think if you read that much, you always think I have to write too. And so I always have written short stories and a lot of poetry. And about 10 years ago, I sat down and started Mariposa, my first book. And I put it away a lot, and then I came back to it and put it away. And so I've been writing that one for a while. I guess I've always been this writer and reader. I think that was the whole question. I get distracted.
That's okay. So you went through and got a PhD?
Yeah, I have a PhD in American literature, and I can teach that and women's writing and film and popular culture studies and composition. So, your freshman literature course, that would be me.
Awesome.
I don't do it right now. I stopped this January teaching here in town because it's hard to do that and be creative at the same time. Really.
I agree, and that was going to be my next question. Are you actively teaching? And what's the difference? Where is that that switch in your brain that allows you to teach people and critique people, but then how do you switch to being creative? And like you said, it's hard, but what is that like?
It is hard. I do better if I'm teaching just straight up literature. I read and write about the writers that I like, and so it's easier when I'm reading a lot of their stuff. But if I'm just teaching how to write the freshman comp research paper about, cultural practices or my argument of what I did over the summer, I don't know. That's really difficult to switch between I'm grading those papers and writing something creative. So I don't do it as well when I'm doing that. So I don't know the switch. Reading a lot of great writers that I really like, that inspires me. But you don't always have time to do that either if you're grading 100 composition essays over the weekend. So
right.
Something's got to give. The switch is I don't work for a university right now. So that's a switch. You quit. Not everybody can do that. Luckily enough, I was able to do that, at least for now. So We'll see how that turns out.
Do you teach creative writing also, or is it just a literature?
I have never gotten to teach creative writing. I would love to. I've studied it formally a little bit when I was long ago, my first times in college. But mostly I've just given helpful advice. And when you teach English, you always have a few students that come in and say, "Oh, I wrote this poem. Would you read it for me?" And you get to do a little bit of that kind of guidance occasionally. But mostly it's just, no, here's a comma splice, and you can't do that without citing a source. So
right.
It's not super creative. It's very dry. That's a good word for it.
Yeah. Your bio says that you're also a poet.
I am.
Yeah. How? Have you published any poetry?
That's a question. I have, but it's it's been a long, long time. It was in college publications,
Yeah.
and the published stuff that I have is also on a website that I ran for about 10 years called Women Writers. And I published a lot of first time poets and writers and academic types. And I have some of my poetry on there. So it's published. It's very self published. I guess I've been self publishing for a long time, but it's not really, I've thought about doing some of it in Kindle format or something, but I don't think there's a lot of poetry readers, not the same way there are sci-fi and fantasy or mystery or any of those kind of fun things. Poetry is a little harder to encourage, I guess.
Yeah, and we had that conversation with Samuel Peralta when he came on the show, and he had pursued and published poetry for quite a while,
Right.
and he said when I started writing fiction that it just took off like a rocket compared to poetry. I guess the audience is just different for that.
It's very different. And the poetry audience is probably more academic. And
Yeah,
so there are certain pathways you're supposed to take. You're supposed to do certain programs and get published with magazines and journals and certain presses for that. And that's a very specific kind of thing. And I think if you're publishing poetry, especially if you're doing it the way I did, which I called it a zine, kind of indie sort of minded,
yeah.
people just think, oh, anybody can do that. That's just like doing a blog. Well, kind of, but it's I actually have talked with Samuel a little bit about that. We talked about how poetry informs things like the author blurb. When you're writing, when you have to compose your story into a very short piece, when you've written poetry, it's a lot easier. Samuel wrote my blurb for Mariposa for me. He helped me sculpt it into something that I liked because it was hard for me to push a 300-page novel down into 4 lines. And
Right.
that focus, yeah, because
Oh,
you're like, well, I don't want to tell everything.
and that
That
is
focus that you with poetry, it does help a lot with that. And now that I think of it that way, I find myself when I'm writing, I break lines in my prose the way I used to do more with poetry now that I think of it that way. And he actually did. He kind of helped me think of it that way. I was putting them in two different compartments in my head. Now I actually am trying to kind of combine those compartments a little better. So yeah, it was helpful to meet him as soon as I did in the indie writing crowd. So
yeah, he's been a big help to a lot of people for sure. And I don't think people really appreciate the difficulty and the skill that is required in creating a blurb especially for a novel. I think people just read it and they're like, "Oh, that sounds good. I'll buy that," and they have no idea what went into crafting those 4 sentences.
Oh, right. When I teach poetry, actually, I tell students that a poem to a novel, a poem is like a cube of bouillon. When you get that little hard, dense cube, you can drop that into 2 or 3 gallons of boiling water and you get a good start for a soup.
Right.
But poetry is that little cube. It's very condensed, it's very precise, and if you stick it in your mouth, it's disgusting
Mm.
because it's so just strong
Intense.
and intense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all that flavor just explodes. And that's the difference between poetry and prose is how condensed and compact the language needs to be. And a novel, you're writing so much that you got a little carrot here and a little chicken broth there. It's bigger and the blurb is much more like a poem in that way. It needs to be condensed and precise, and you need to get everything that you need there, but not too much. So
Yeah.
it's tricky.
Sure. What's the process like? How's the process different in conceptualizing a novel and thinking of a piece of poetry? Do you approach those two things completely differently? Do the ideas come from different places? Um, what's that like?
I think Yeah, I think they do come from different places in that I'm one of those crazy writers that talks about her characters like they're real, like they're possessing you or something, where
Yeah.
like the first line of Mariposa just came to me. The voice of Meg just popped right out, and then she just insisted on being written, and and she wouldn't shut up. Whereas poetry, sometimes it's like that. But mostly I'll just think of something, an image that I really want to convey, and I'll sit down and kind of sculpt that out. And but the process of writing a novel for me is a lot more research based, and I have to grab pictures, and I have to look at the picture of New Orleans Canal Street, and then I think, ooh, now I know how to describe that scene. Whereas poetry, mostly there's an image or a mood that I'm thinking of. I guess I'm sort of an imagist. And then I write that out. And poetry, I probably don't edit for me as much as I do my novels. I write it and I play with it a little bit and I change the lines and meters and stuff, but mostly I just sort of leave it, which is probably why I'm not really a great poet. I mean, I'm a poet, but I'm not going to get, awards. So it's more for myself and my family probably. The writing, the fiction, I think I can do that okay. And I think people kind of like that.
Ab-
Probably more than the mostly I think they're being polite with the poems. They're like, "Oh yeah, that's nice, Kim. Sure. Yeah.
well,
Thank you for sharing."
poetry seems to be a lot more subjective also. You've got people that either like poetry in general or not, and then you've got, lots of different genres and flavors of poetry. And the more I think about it, that's kind of the way it is with fiction too. But
It is. It's just
it
like,
seems to be more objective
yeah, like, well,
or
it's like that cube
subjective.
of bouillon. You're gonna like it in some ways, and you're not gonna like it in others. It's the flavors, the genres. I think a lot of the thing with poetry is a lot of people don't know how to read it.
Right.
When you took English class in high school, your English teacher said, "Oh, this poem has an apple in it, and an apple is always symbolic of sin." And the students go, "Okay, I don't get why."
Right.
And so students don't really understand that. They don't get why is an apple a symbol of something, or why because she used the color white is it supposed to mean purity? And the teacher says it just does, and they go okay. So they think and a lot of students approach it as though it's some sort of riddle. It's got to mean something. What does this line mean? I had a student one time, we were talking about an Edna St. Vincent Millay poem, and she's very New Englandy and kind of proper from a certain generation in some ways. And she compared a lover's breaking her heart to him snapping off a tree branch carelessly, and how she should have known he would break her heart that way. And the student said, "Oh, well, he must have broken her arm or something." And so they want to compare it that way. They want to say there must be some connection in real life and the poem. So they don't really understand the symbolism there. It's kind of hard to explain sometimes. So.
Right. And your analogy of the bouillon cube is perfect. I don't think I've ever thought of it that way, but where in a novel you have chapter after chapter to really paint in nuance and to bring out subtle character traits and things like that. And in a poem, you're hiding sometimes so much meaning in one line that needs to be unraveled and really thought about and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. You got it.
Right.
You get an A.
Well, thank you. I can put that on my resume now.
Exactly.
Tell us about Mariposa or Mariposa. Am I
Yeah.
pronouncing it correctly?
It's Mariposa, I think. I also am terrible at Spanish, so I have a lot of it in my book, but I read it. I don't really speak it super well. I'm pretty sure it's Mariposa, although I'm not doing the proper R. My Spanish teacher would yell. Um, but
I
it
won't
is.
attempt it either.
Yeah, let's
Yeah,
not.
let's not. We
That
don't
could
want
be
to
a
offend
yeah.
an entire
I think
segment of our.
French R is yeah, yeah. People would be turning it off. No, don't do that.
Okay.
It's about a woman. It actually has two main protagonists, And the primary protagonist is named Meg, and she is a ghost. And you know this, I'm not giving away a spoiler, because that first line of her story is about wearing the perfect outfit
Yeah.
when she died. You know that right away. And then the second story main character, is a girl who would have been her stepdaughter. And they have complementary storylines. One person speaks for a while and the other jumps in. About Meg has to figure out, as all ghosts would, why she's still there, why she hasn't crossed over to wherever we go. And what she figures out eventually is that she's there to help the girl who would have been her stepdaughter to move on, to find love, something, whatever she doesn't know, but she's that's what she's got to do eventually. And Meg has a quest pattern where she has to figure that out, why she's there and who she is, and she has kind of a special power. And then at the end of the story, they eventually do get back together, and big fun scene of exciting things happen, and we move on from there. I'm trying not to give away too much. It takes place in San Antonio,
Yeah.
which was where I was living when I first wrote it. And then I moved away, and I found with the research I was doing that I had a really big crush on the city. I just would go back there and I would just look longingly at buildings that were in my story, just mooning over them. And so San Antonio's almost a character in the book, I think, because of that. So,
That's fascinating. There
huh?
are some stories uh, pull so much uh, from the city they're set in, or the atmosphere, or that. Was there anything in particular about the city that just really resonated and made it become a character to you, or is it just the general vibe of the place?
It's kind of the general vibe of the place. There are a few places in the U.S. that have that kind of old world, almost European feel to it. You've got New
Hmm.
Orleans, and I've been to Boston, and that felt like that also. But San Antonio is very flavored with Mexico, and you have that kind of feeling to it of history being there, walking along downtown. And some of it, of course, is not that old. The Riverwalk, for example, is fairly new architecturally, but it feels old. And that's kind of part of it, is it has that sensation of haunting. I guess that's why it's a ghost story, because you walk around a corner and you could run into Theodore Roosevelt on a horse, and not in a Night at the Museum way, like in a Rough Riders about to go to war sort of way. And the
Right.
Alamo is like that. You know, you walk through there, and once you get past the secret passageway to the basement, which we are not supposed to tell people is real, um, then you go in, and it just feels like there's history there, and that's kind of the vibe that the story kind of did. It's also super friendly. Everyone there is just really nice, and you go and you have a margarita down at the Riverwalk, and then everyone, maybe they're not, but you think they are because you've had that awesome margarita. So
Right.
yeah, so that flavor is just a big part of it. Just that, I don't know, that Texas,
Yeah.
just big Texas Tex-Mex really flavor to it.
Where did the idea first come from for the story, Mariposa? Did it? You
Oh,
said that Meg, that first line came to you, and then what did it
it
begin with
did.
her?
It did, just all of a sudden. And like I said, it's kind of one of those things, you think writers are crazy because they talk about these voices they hear. I'm really not schizophrenic, I don't think, but I just heard her voice, and it was sassy and kind of funny. Some of the people who have read it, she sounds like someone it would be fun to go drinking with. And I think, yeah, Meg would be a hoot because she just has this voice of um, kind of sarcasm and witty, and she's very unassuming in a lot of ways. And she just kind of wants to be, I don't know, but her voice, that line about um, the outfit that you're wearing when you die being what you have on as a ghost, that came, I think, from just every movie ever. If you're a ghost, you're stuck in what you're wearing when you died. I mean, if you're wearing pajamas, there you go, eternity in those ratty, holy pajamas that you have worn
Right.
since college, right?
Well,
So
and only
it's a
a
risk.
writer can look at that and zone in on that one aspect. Like most people, you know, see ghosts in the same clothes and they never pick up on that. But you know, an artist sees that and is like, wow, that's got to be driving them crazy.
Right, right. I mean, come on, maybe you were really a fashionista and one day you were
Right.
having a bad day and you just rushed out to drop something off at not the airport, the post office, right? And you got in an accident and now you're stuck in, Winnie the Pooh shirt and jeans and it would just be torment. It'd be
Oh, Baba.
horrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that line came, and I started telling my husband about it a little bit, and I knew I wanted there to be kind of a love story. And we started talking about almost the star-crossed lovers, like Romeo and Juliet or something, how that's a good storyline. And there is that in the story a little bit, but it became a secondary part of Meg kind of finding herself. I told someone that there is because the subtitle is a love story. And I
Right.
told someone there is a love story in it, but it's not entirely what people think it is.
Well,
So
and real
somebody
life love
else,
stories rarely are the fodder for novels or don't play out the way they do in typical
well,
novels.
yeah, real life love stories are mostly they're either really tragic and you break up, or they're kind of boring and you end up sitting on the couch watching marathons on Netflix.
Right.
That's kind of nice, but it doesn't work well for a novel. You want
Right.
death and tragedy and all of
Yeah.
that stuff in a
Yeah.
novel.
What when you talk about the characters talking to you, when I first talked to Stefan Boltz last year, I was so relieved when he told me the story of when he was writing The Fourth Sage and his character Ares started talking to him and telling him to, I'll paraphrase, to get off his butt and write the story. And I was like, oh God, I'm not crazy. It's because I have the same
Yeah,
experience, you know? And it's,
it is.
I think people probably think we're crazy, but that really is the way it happens a lot of times.
And maybe we are a little crazy, but we're not,
Yeah.
bad
Yeah,
crazy.
we're just
Not
a
usually,
different crazy.
just a little different. I'm kind of a Jungian. Carl
Yeah.
Jung believed that there was this collective unconscious and that we tapped into this mythic, huge source of stories. And I sort of in that way, and I almost think that that voice that we hear sometimes, that's what that is. It's the muse or the collective unconscious or whatever it is that those stories come from. And Stephen King has a story actually where he talks about it and he called it forness. And there's like magic dust almost, and it's kind of crazy. And I think of it that way almost too, because it's just, I've had stories that I've wanted to write and I've put it off, and then I've seen some other writer write almost that exact story. And I think, darn, they got the piece of the collective unconscious that was trying to get me. And they got it instead because I didn't do it.
Wow, I've never thought of it
Like,
that way, but that's actually kind of amazing.
well, because the story wants to be told. And
Yeah.
if you don't tell it, it'll find some other susceptible, crazy person to force to sit up all night and write. It'll say, okay, you're not listening.
Some
And it'll be a little bit different,
right.
but it'll be your story. So
Because the
that's why so
story's
many
going to be
people go crazy.
yeah, well the story's going to be filtered through your experiences a lot of times too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, that probably sounds just as crazy as the other stuff, though.
Probably, but
So,
that's okay.
this isn't going out on air or anything, so people know I'm crazy now, right? Oh,
It's
my secrets are out.
secrets. See, that's what this podcast does. It just brings it all out. You just put it all on the table here. That's right.
Well, that's what they say, right? In the South, we don't hide crazy. We put it on the front porch with some iced
We
tea
just
and sweet
paraded it. Yeah,
tea.
that's right. We paraded out in front of the neighbors. That's right.
Yep. That's what the porch swings are
That's
for.
right. That's right. Speaking of the South, and you've mentioned New Orleans a couple times, and those of you that do not live in the South, it is pronounced New Orleans, not New Orleans.
Right.
Uh,
New Orleans,
yeah,
it's not that either.
no, it's either New Orleans or New Orleans. But
That's right.
how does how does living in the South affect your writing, do you think?
Um, I, you know what? What's weird is I am technically a carpetbagger because my mom
Say
was
it ain't
from
so.
Illinois. I know. I came as soon as I could. I was a child. I was probably 2 years old when we moved to Kentucky. So
Yeah.
that's the first time I made it
Okay.
into the promised land.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I didn't choose to be
I
born.
understand.
But so then we moved south when I was really young. What happens though is a lot of people in both areas will say, you ain't from around here, are you?
Right.
So, because I don't talk like anybody anywhere, it, except when I'm in Illinois, people say I sound like I'm from the South, and when
Right.
I'm here, they say I sound different. Um, but it really does seem to be important to my writing, because setting does seem to be one of my things, and the South. San Antonio was huge in my first book. My short story, Mrs. Johnson's Blues, is about the Mississippi Delta, and that's where I live kind of now. I'm the Louisiana Delta, but we're not that far
Yeah.
away. And that kind of slow, hot summer day. And it's just very important, I guess, to my writing, that setting and that kind of laid back, but the magic that kind of exists in all of that. It does seem to be showing up.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question is about Mrs. Johnson's Blues. What is that story about?
That is a little short story that I think will probably be eventually
Yeah.
more short stories that I want to turn into a collection eventually. But it came to me, I was listening to an interview, and I wish it would be a better story if I could remember who it was. I should just lie and say it was definitely Mick Jagger was talking about where his inspiration comes
Hmm.
from, and he said Robert Johnson. And I thought that was kind of hilarious because here's this British guy and talking about this man from the 1930s, this Southern black man who sang the blues. And I thought, wow, that's really kind of interesting. And as I was thinking about that, just the idea of um, who his muse might actually have been, because the whole story is that he went down to the crossroads and made a deal with the devil,
Right.
and that's how he became a great blues
Right.
singer. That's again the first lines of my story. And so just that sort of different take on that story, instead of imagining that the devil was this guy in black sunglasses or pointy horns, and I just imagined who that might be. And that's where that story comes from. So
Awesome.
it's so short, I don't want to say too much more
I
because
understand.
it'll totally give it away.
I totally get it. And you're absolutely right. There are certain things that are inherent to a particular place that really inform not only the story but the style of storytelling and the I don't really have a good word for it, but the flavor of the people. But you're absolutely right when you're talking about the Delta, and you even mention that setting, and people automatically have a certain expectation, or their brain shifts to a certain way of thinking when you start talking about that. So I think place is a huge factor in fiction, especially.
Oh yeah, I think so. Like Flannery O'Connor, a lot of my earlier short stories probably were not rip-offs, but I thought of it that way with her. Like
Oh
she
yeah,
writes this Southern Gothic stuff where people suddenly discover that the universe is just not what they thought it was ever. And, a universe where, for example, someone told me a story once about a letter she wrote where the Klan was going around, driving around in their outfits, giving out Christmas baskets to the poor.
right.
And so you thought, and she said, I don't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It's just here.
Right, right.
That's the kind of crazy
Yep,
that I live near.
right.
And that's kind of it too,
Hello, Kim.
and
Yep.
it's kind of beautiful, and the environment here is hot and green, and just all of that just comes into the story. There's just no way around it. So
Yeah. Um, in in my book Mulligan, I take that story of the crossroads and kind of poke fun at it a little bit too. That's a fun thing that and I don't know, before. I mean, Robert Johnson was huge in his day, and then kind of went into obscurity, and then all of these British wave of rockers from the '60s started, looking for other inspiration and started going through the Mississippi Delta, and all of a sudden there was this revival, and then the legends seem to get twice as big when people start digging again. It's kind of funny.
it is. And it was the British folks finding that is amazing, because yeah, that was so important. I once told someone that rock and roll as we know it comes from the South,
Oh yeah.
because so much of it comes from that blues tradition and jazz and all that and folk music. And they said, "Oh, I never heard that." And I said, "Well, it's got to be
Oh
obvious.
yeah. It's
As soon as you start hearing people like the Beatles or the British rockers talking about that, then they learned it from these great people like Robert
oh
Johnson,
yeah.
and just oh,
Yeah,
so
and and,
yeah,
and, and so much so that Eric Clapton and Cream recorded Crossroads and had a
right.
huge hit, and then folks like the Stones and the Beatles and um, Cream and Led Zeppelin all start digging through Robert Johnson and through Lightning Hopkins and Muddy Waters and the whole thing. But it's really funny how these cultural things take on uh, whole new lives of their own and become derivative. And we see the same thing happen in literature.
Right. It's that collective unconscious
Yeah,
again. It's just once that story out there.
that's right.
So that's part of it, I
Yeah.
think.
You talked earlier about when you first started getting the voice of Meg talking to you and this story started taking shape, that you started talking to your husband about it. Do you
Right.
do you kind of bounce ideas off of him?
I do, especially if there's a male in the
Yeah.
story, because he has a lot of great perspective on that. And sometimes he'll have something that I just go, oh, yeah, of course that's what he'd be doing. The next book in the Mariposa is going to have a sequel, and it's actually the guys from the story.
Awesome.
And like it has a guy in there who's going to be who is a boxer.
Yeah.
And my husband fought in the San Fernando gym in San Antonio. That's like the big gym downtown where all the greats box. And I'm going to forget the name. If he were here, he'd remind me. One of the San Antonio boxers, that's where he was from. And Andrew used to be the skinny redheaded guy who fought with those guys there. And he wasn't great, but he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
And so I'll ask him, what do you think would happen here? And he'll tell me, and he'll say, oh, no, 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 you're wrong about that. And I'll say, no, I'm not. And then he'll explain it to me, and I'll go, okay, all right. And there are a few scenes in Mariposa that he basically made me rewrite once I told him what I was thinking of doing, because it was wrong. And so the funny thing is, he actually hasn't read any of them, but he tells me things that I then work into the story. So sometimes he wants me to write a completely different book, and I say, no, you have to go write that book.
Right.
That one's yours, because I'm not writing that. But sometimes it still makes it in there. So
That's
yeah, he's a great bouncer offer.
absolutely. It's great to have someone to be able to do that with. What about the story that you contributed to the Tales from Pennsylvania? I think yours was called Sisters of Solomon.
It was,
Yep.
and I read Michael Bunker's book. I think at the beginning of summer last year is when I found that. And I thought, this is really interesting. I think that this universe that he's created is fascinating. And then I went online and I found him and I friended him, and I was seeing so many people writing stories set in his universe. And I thought, I really want to write one too, but I couldn't think of what I wanted to write about. And again, I'm going to sound crazy, but I started having these dreams from this woman's perspective of that universe that Michael Bunker's characters inhabit, New Pennsylvania.
Right.
And it just started coming in these waves. And I guess the first images I got were of a cornfield and a rainstorm. And I thought I wanted it to be about kind of domestic things, women's things, because Michael's story with Jed goes off into a young man's adventure.
Right.
And I thought there are other stories there that would be from a different perspective.
Sure.
And then one day, as I was just trying to think of a story, and that dream that I kept having wouldn't leave me alone, I was sitting on my porch in the backyard, and it started to rain. And the first line for that story came to me, and I just sat down and started writing. And then I realized what it was about this young woman who was trying to kind of come to terms with one of the worst things that could happen thanks to the transport's evil empire,
right.
you know? And the story came from there, and I sat down and I wrote it probably in about 2 days. I got that first draft out, and then I went back and fiddled with it, and I shared it with Chris Porteau, actually, and he said, I like this, and maybe you can add that, and he liked it, and he said, well, eventually we're going to do this anthology, and we'll put you on the list. And I eventually made it onto the list, and I was just really excited because it was such a great collection. I love every story in that collection.
I know, there's such fascinating stories.
Yeah. And there's so many people saw different windows into that universe that it shows that beauty of the collaborative project.
Yeah.
Because one author looking at something is going to see from their perspective, like you said before. But lots of people looking are going to say, well, what would happen if this other character was there? And it's just, not a single story doesn't make you go, oh yeah, I need more of that. All of them are like that. You want more.
And the beauty of that, I think, is that he did not write a 1,000-page treatise on New Pennsylvania where he fleshed out every corner of the universe that could be. He left it, built just enough of the universe that other people could look at it and say, oh, wow, what if this and what if that? And that was an excellent thing in the way he opened up the universe for other people. I think has been wonderful and is doing a lot of good.
Yeah, one of the things that I have studied in my academic career, we talk about women's writers. I'm going to forget the theorist, so I'm sorry, theory education. But someone said to find the gaps. I want to say it's Toni Morrison, and I'm not sure if it's her, so don't quote me on that. But find the gaps, find the things that haven't been told.
Right.
And so by writing what he wrote, this interesting story, which is basically a hero quest, it inspired people to look in there and see the gaps. If you wrote 1,000 pages on how the people there did their laundry, I'm thinking of an author that I won't name that does that in their work.
Yeah.
Then nobody has any room. There are no gaps. And so that's one of the reasons why that's such an interesting thing, and why this kind of fan fiction is changing the way writing happens, I think, because people can look at the story and say, oh, I think this would happen. And then authors are so accessible, some authors are so accessible that you can write to them and say, hey, would you mind if I wrote this little story about a woman in your universe? And they go, yeah, go for it. That wouldn't have happened probably 30 years ago.
Right.
First of all, how do you write to someone before, you wrote to their fan club or something, and maybe it got to them. But it's kind of exciting. I think it's as big of a change in writing as the internet was in just basic communication. It's still a beginning of the wave, but it's growing, I think.
Yeah. Well, speaking of those collaborative type projects, I think we would be remiss to not mention the new work that you're doing right now, and in a much, I won't say a much bigger universe, but it's a big universe. What are you working on right now?
Um, I am so very lucky to be able to write about what we mentioned earlier, New Orleans,
Yeah.
in this project called The Apocalypse Weird. And I am destroying my own little piece of paradise. So I got New Orleans and a little bit right now. There's one character who's from where I'm from, which is Shreveport. There's She's here now. In fact, I just wrote a scene yesterday that finally gets her scooped up into the issues that are happening, and she's going to go to New Orleans. But so Louisiana, and especially the French Quarter, and it is the apocalypse, and we get to figure out what would be cool if the end of the world was happening in your neck of the woods. Michael Bunker and Nick Cole, Chris Porto, Jennifer Ellis. You've had at least half of us on your podcast already, and it's so much fun.
Yeah.
And just the whole collaborative nature of, hey, I have this character that I'm writing about that's doing this thing, and then that makes me have the idea of, oh, I know, I'll make this thing happen. And that is so much fun to be able to kind of play in that huge sandbox and then also burn things in your mind. I haven't burned anything in real life yet. So I think sometimes that's a way of letting off steam.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you think that person in carpool line really made me mad. I will write about them.
Right.
And I will do terrible things in carpool line in my book. So then you don't have to do it in real life.
Right. Right. So, can you give us any details about your book that you're writing other than it's set in New Orleans?
Yeah, in my story, it takes place kind of the beginning of the whole end of the world process. And I have my bad guy is he's not really, well, I'm trying to steer clear of voodoo because there's a whole religious symbolism thing there that I don't want to have to disrespect at all. So I'm calling it hoodoo, which is more folk magic. But I'm also using a figure that is very prominent in voodoo called Kalfu. And he is, a lot of people know Papa Legba. He's one of the voodoo figures that has made it into popular culture. And everybody thinks Papa Legba is Kalfu, but Kalfu's kind of the evil twin of Legba. And they are crossroads Loa. And the Loa are like in Catholicism, you have saints,
Right.
you know, so the regular person talks to the saint, and the saint goes and talks to God and intercedes for you. In voodoo, that's the same thing. You talk to your particular Loa, and they go and intercede with the big guy. And so Papa Legba is the one who opens doorways, and his symbol is the key. So in Catholicism, he would be maybe Saint Peter. But like I said, Kalfu is his bad evil twin, and he does the black magic. And a lot of times people show him with he's this big, strong, kind of tough guy. In my book, he's got these gorgeous long dreadlocks, and he's wearing this shark skin suit, really muscly. And he gets down in New Orleans, and the things that are happening are I don't want to give too much away. The French Quarter does not fare well, let's say that. And then there's some stuff happening in the Superdome that's kind of exciting. And then there might even be eventually a hurricane that comes and pretty much ruins a lot of people's days. So.
Gotcha. Do you know when your book is coming out?
I think mine is set for, I want to say it's March 2nd or March 3rd. It's one of those very early March days.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm in the second wave. The first wave is what, February 23rd, 22nd? And then mine is in the second wave. The only other author that I've seen on the roster for that day so far is Eric Tozzi. Tozzi? Is that Tozy? I'm going to pronounce it wrong, and he's going to send me a message
Yeah,
later.
we're just going to go ahead.
Just say Eric.
Yeah, we're going to go
Well,
ahead and preemptively apologize to Eric,
sorry,
and from now on he will just be referred to as Eric.
just Eric.
Yeah, just Eric.
So we're currently on that roster for that day, and I don't know who else is going to be on there. There's 3 more because there's going to be 5 dropping that day, and yeah, so that's mine, and I'm almost done with it. I think I'm at 88% my writing yesterday, and I know I've got the story. It's just right now it's downhill. I'm
Yeah,
coasting down the hill because I've just got to finish everything up.
awesome. Well, we really look forward to that. What else do you have in the works after you get the Apocalypse Weird book done? And you said there's a sequel that you're working on for Mariposa.
Right. Yeah.
Any other things that you have planned out? I know you're expecting an exciting 2015.
Yes, the Mariposa sequel, which right now is called Orpheus and the Butterfly, that's going to be next. And then I actually want to write a New Pennsylvania novel that is the follow-up to the short story from Tales from Pennsylvania, The Sisters of Solomon.
Awesome.
And so in that story, she kind of finds her purpose at the end, and the purpose is being very disruptive to transport's plans in New Pennsylvania. And a big group of women get out there, and I think I've got that one called Finding Deborah right now. So there's going to be this group of women who, honestly, they're terrorists, and they're getting after. You call them terrorists when they lose, right? And when they're fighting the good guys, and they're freedom fighters, really, I guess, because the transport is evil. So they're out there, and they're going to be taking the transport battle to them with very kind of domestic sorts of things. I know I have a hacker witch that I'm going to put in there.
Oh, nice.
There's going to be, yeah. And I've got, because you've got to have a hacker when you're dealing with Michael Bunker's universe. And then I've got a woman who's going to be a midwife. She's going to be in there. And then just, they're going to be finding their way and fighting the big evil empire. So that's the next big novel. I also have an idea for, it's either going to be a collection of short stories or maybe a novel about some biblical figures. I don't know why I keep going back to these kind of religious-based stories, but I seem kind of fascinated with it. Like the story of Jezebel.
Yeah. Well, it's so much part of our culture in the South, and it's hard to escape, and it becomes really ingrained in the culture and in the conversation, and
Right.
it's hard to escape, to be honest.
It is. And I really like telling the woman's version of stories.
Yeah.
So you hear this story, but what about, okay, so what about Samson and Delilah? You hear Samson's story. What was Delilah up to? Why'd she do that? So that's why I ask those questions. Lot's wife is someone I'm also interested in, and I'd like to maybe do something with her. I don't know if that's going to happen right away. I also have a story about, it's another apocalypse story, actually, the world after an actual global warming incident that is not super bad, like it's kind of bad,
Yeah.
but everybody sort of adapts, and that takes place in Alaska.
Nice.
So that's another one that I've got
Awesome.
in the pipeline. Oh, I almost forgot too. I also have a story about a dragon.
I was going to ask you about the Dragon
Yeah,
Chronicles.
The Dragon Chronicles, yeah. That one is coming out, and it is, it's not a fantasy-based dragon. It's actually a sci-fi one.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, it's an origin myth for Earth, kind of. And then the dragons are if you've ever read, the first sci-fi novel I ever read was by Robert Heinlein, and it was called The Star Beast.
Yes.
And yes, and that apparently was what was in my head when I was writing this one, because I have these empathic, telepathic dragons, and the way they navigate is they've got a ship that's partially organic and partially cybernetic, and the dragons need the human interface to have a human passenger base. And so they work with a human, and then the dragons are the intermediary between the ship and the human. So there's sort of this complex sort of psychic thing going on there. But that story is going to be pretty neat. And I actually want to write a bigger version of that too. Once I wrote the short story, I realized that there was more to write there also. So I don't seem to be able to write a standalone short story. They're all going to be bigger.
It happens.
Yeah.
It happens.
One of these days, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah.
So.
Well, Kim Wells, thank you so much for taking out time on your Saturday afternoon to come chat with me about all of your awesome stuff going on. Where can people find you to get more of your work and to follow what you have going on?
My main webpage is kimwells.net.
Yeah.
You can find everything there. That's the easy one.
Okay.
And then I'm on Facebook, so Facebook/Kim Wells Writes. I'm on Twitter. I think that's Dandelion Dreams, but you just look me up there.
Okay.
I don't do a lot of Twitter yet. I'm trying to build up that Twitter thing.
Yeah.
I'm
Awesome.
very big in India on Twitter for some reason because of a mistake.
Okay.
Someone accidentally tweeted me instead of the person they meant to, and then I got followed I went in there the other day and there was like 100 retweets of my name, and I was like, whoa, I'm hitting it big.
So,
and then I went, oh,
one of those,
it's not me.
One of those happy accidents.
Yeah. It looks awesome, but so that's the main place. KimWells.net will get pretty much everything if you go on there.
And on your About Me page on KimWells.net, I think you have links for your social media there, right?
I do, and I have a mailing list that eventually, once I get more than just, 2 friends who I force to sign up, I will be sending out giveaways and stuff on there.
Well, in the show notes, I'll put links to your website and your social media, and I'll also link up your newsletter so people can go and sign up there.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much.